In this video we are going to take a look at the basics of building a Deathwatch Army of Renown list aimed at beginners. This is the follow-up to my army building guide for beginners released back in August, which focused on basic rules as well as getting started with a regular Deathwatch army list. But now that we already got our feet wet, it is time to dig into the Kill Team Strike Force, unlocking the true potential of the Deathwatch. First, we will quickly look at what rules are relevant for building our first Army of Renown list. Second, we will dive right into army building itself, based on the list I provided in the previous beginner video. After that, we will focus on a few handy tricks when starting out with our Army of Renown, before concluding this episode with a quick wrap-up.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer, and I will be guiding you through this video.
Just as a quick reminder, the very basics of army building itself, including the different game modes, picking the right size, using army building tools, as well as picking the right secondaries for Deathwatch, are covered in my previously released beginner's guide to army building, which I linked in the description. For the purposes of this video, I am assuming that you are familiar with these basic rules, as well as the kill teams of the Deathwatch. For the latter, I also have a dedicated series available on my channel to bring you up to speed on the most competitive ways to bring along mixed units and equipping them with fitting loadouts. With that out of the way, let's focus on our Deathwatch Army of Renown, the Kill Team Strike Force. Introduced in War Zone Octarius Book 1, The Rising Tide, it follows the traditional Army of Renown approach by offering unique benefits as well as restrictions. In this particular case, the restrictions are that we can only take kill teams upgraded with specialisms, characters and transports, including our unique flyer, the Corvus Blackstar. In turn, we get a couple unique stratagems, a relic, a warlord trait. We are able to pick each specialism twice, and perhaps the best and most thematic of them all, we can pick a different chapter tactic each round as an army-wide benefit. Back at release, I have covered the full rules of our Army of Renown in a dedicated review, the link is in the description. As it currently stands, I think what has really worked in favor of the Army of Renown these past few months is that the restrictions have turned out to be almost irrelevant, while the extra benefits remain very desirable. To give a few examples, back with the old bodyguard rules and mission settings, company veterans were amazing, but now they have been nerfed to oblivion. Vehicles outside of dreadnoughts have never made the big breakthrough, and even the go-to dreadnoughts for Deathwatch themselves have suffered from points increases as well as mission changes. Meantime, kill teams are more desirable than ever, and our specialisms have also received a discount through the latest points rebalance. As such, by playing our Army of Renown, we can bring along the strength of our faction, the kill teams, and get additional benefits on top, while the former downsides have pretty much become irrelevant at this point. Good times, but be aware that this may of course change again in the future, and perhaps most significantly, our Army of Renown has an expiry date of January 2023, and we don't really know what GW is going to do about that. With this lengthy introduction out of the way, let's finally dig into the list building itself. Back when I did my beginner's guide to a regular army list, one of the main points I wanted to focus on is making the list as compatible with a future Army of Renown list as possible. Nothing worse than freshly starting out with Deathwatch and realizing just after a few months in that your initial purchases are incompatible with the most effective way to play Deathwatch. As a quick reminder, our original beginner's list looked as following: a classic 3 HQ approach with a cheap and durable captain on bike, a Primaris chaplain on bike, as well as a Phobos librarian. We then have 4 kill teams, consisting out of a single Indomitor, 2 Proteus kill teams, as well as a Spectress. To round the list up, we went for an Apothecary, a squad of Eradicators, and either a Corvus Blackstar or a Redemptor Dreadnought. Out of all these, the only one that would have to be left on the shelf for playing an Army of Renown list is the Dreadnought, as mentioned in the original guide. But I think it is fair to say that depending on where Deathwatch is headed past January 2023, you might see this fellow again sooner rather than later. But anyway, getting back to our Army of Renown list, one of the big questions that any Deathwatch player will face during list building is whether to go for 4 or 5 kill teams. Due to the limited number of datasheets and mandatory specialisms, hitting that 2000 points mark can be very difficult, as it is very easy to either overshoot or ending up with 50 to 100 points spare that don't really get us anywhere. As it currently stands, I think having 5 kill teams is the way to go, as it makes for a good mixture between having enough bodies, while still being able to bring some character support along. There has been the odd competitive list with 4 pricey kill teams and the Corvus Blackstar in War Zone Nephilim, but if anything, I would say the Nephilim mission settings basically scream for more kill teams these days. With this in mind, what we first have to do is eliminate the invalid entries for our previous beginner list in order to make it compatible with our Army of Renown restrictions. This includes the Eradicator squad as well as the Redemptor, and as a side note, if you took the Corvus Blackstar instead, remove that one too, simply because we will need the points. As far as the Eradicators are concerned, while we will not add them back into this particular list, it would be perfectly possible to add them into the Indomitor kill team in case you were looking for some extra anti-tank. This could for instance be a good option if you are playing sniper eliminators over Las Fusils. Looking at our list, we are now at 4 characters and 4 kill teams, which means we will be using our spare points to fill the list up with a much desired 5th kill team, as well as equipping each of them with a specialism, which is mandatory for the Army of Renown. For this particular list, we are going for a forest kill team with Assault Hellblasters. These are really great into other power armored opponents, of which you might find plenty at the beginner to medium tier level. For specialisms, we can now take 2 of each, and what is very important for our Army of Renown is the Aquila specialism, as it makes the unique stratagem, Specialism Extremis, work against any datasheet, regardless of battlefield role. More on this later in the video. But anyway, what I recommend here are double Aquila on your heavy hitters, which is the Indomitor as well as the Clangby style Proteus kill team, and then using double Dominators on the Fortis and the second Proteus kill team. On the Spectres, I usually take Venator for the last Fusils, but in case you are running snipers, you can also take Purgatus for the same number of points. Furthermore, thanks to the Army of Renown, we can now move the Lord of Deceit Warlord trait from the Librarian to the Sergeant through a unique stratagem, which results in an extra wound on the Sergeant. Then lastly, we can swap the Biker Captain out for a Watchmaster, which is very decent with his Chapter Master rerolls, but a bit slow and more difficult to position well when compared to the Captain. In case you are uncomfortable with that switch, just leave the Captain in. He's perfectly fine, and the spare points allow for some additional war gear. Speaking of which, in order to bring the list just under 2000 points, we need to drop 1 Storm Shield on a vet in the Infantry Bikes Proteus kill team, but this is fine as it has always been just a nice extra, rather than being mandatory. Looking at our finalized list, we now have 3 HQs, 5 kill teams upgraded with specialisms, as well as the Apothecary. This is a relatively mild transition from the previous list, which should allow you to focus on learning the Army of Renown rules, rather than having to learn a whole new list on top of that as well. As far as the Army of Renown is concerned, there are 3 handy tricks to help you getting started with this new set of complex rules. The first and most important is selecting from the different chapter tactics. Now this by itself warrants a dedicated video, and I will look into making a guide for this in the future, but to go over it very briefly, basically the Veterans of the Long Vigil ability allows you to select a different chapter tactic each battle round. This is army wide, and you are only allowed to select each of them once. You can find an overview in the Space Marine Codex on pages 94 and 95, followed by the successor chapter Tactics on pages 96 and 97, and it is best to spend some extra time familiarizing yourself with all of these. While you can only make a single successor chapter Tactics pick at once, a neat workaround to only being able to select each chapter Tactics once per game is to go for the main chapter 1 first, and then select the successor tactics in another round that shares a similar benefit that you are looking for. As an example, if you are facing an army with heavy mortal wound output, you can go Black Templars for round 1 and then pick the successor tactics warded in another round. Picking the right chapter tactics for the occasion can really make or break a matchup. Well, I think that this is only something to master with a lot of practice. As a rule of thumb, if you are not planning any major plays for a turn, for instance turn 1, pick a defensive chapter tactics. Then when you are switching to offense, use White Scars for advance and charge, or when you know that you are going to hammer things with your Clangby style Proteus skill team, go Space Wolves. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you are going second, you are giving away your plan a little, as your opponent might guess your intent based on what chapter tactics you pick, but unfortunately this cannot be helped. In some instances, you could even play mind games with that. Then the second important one is the Stratagem Specialism Extremis, which auto-wounds its target, making it ideal to remove threats of any size, which can otherwise be a potential issue with infantry-heavy lists lacking anti-tank. As previously mentioned, the Aquila Specialism is ideal for this, as it makes the stratagem work against any battlefield roll, while all the other specialisms only make it work against the corresponding battlefield roll. As an example, for the Dominator Specialism, you can only use Extremis against the elite battlefield roll. Furthermore, at 3 CP, this is a very pricey stratagem, and due to the War Zone Nephilim CP changes, I personally plan around using Extremis once per game, usually during round 2 or 3, preferably on an Indomitor kill team with a lot of shots. As a side note, you can also combine this by selecting a shooting-friendly chapter tactics like one of the Fists. For this particular beginner's list, we are starting with 1 CP, and the plan is to play conservative during turn 1. As such, we would be ready to go Extremis during round 2 or 3 as mentioned. If you end up being able to Extremis for a second time, I always consider this a bonus. But ultimately, use this to deal with a major threat that your list otherwise would struggle with. Then lastly, we have Battlefield Teleportation, another unique stratagem of the Army of Renown, which is great to either move a kill team into position early game, like you can set them up on the board and remove them turn 1, to then bring them back in turn 2, or to score points in late rounds by setting them up in table corners that they might otherwise not have reached on foot. All in all, while the Deathwatch Army of Renown adds complex rules to an already complex faction, I think our Kill Team Strike Force is both incredibly thematic and a lot of fun to play with the different chapter tactics and potent stratagems. As a beginner, I recommend taking it slow and preferably start picking up the Army of Renown rules with a list that you are to a large part already familiar with. For this, doing something along the lines of playing a kill team heavy list without AOR rules first, then adjusting them to AOR like we did in this video really goes a long way. Either way, what better time to play Deathwatch? To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the basics of building a Deathwatch Army of Renown list, which adds complex rules to an already complex faction. But nonetheless, by adjusting the beginner's list I covered in my earlier guide to list building, the jump from regular rules to AOR is not as drastic anymore. In this particular beginner's list, we are using 3 HQs and 5 kill teams, which is the current go-to, also for more competitive lists, and then I am also keeping the Apothecary as the 4th character. The 3 HQs are the Primaris Chaplain on bike, a Librarian and the Watchmaster, though you can also keep the Captain on bike over the ladder for much simpler positioning. For the kill teams, while we are keeping the Spectres, Indomitor and Double Proteus from the original beginners list, adding a forest kill team with Assault Hellblasters adds a little extra punch against power armored factions, which can be very beneficial on a beginner to medium tier level, where I think Space Marines are still very popular. While our Army of Renown requires a lot of practice rounds in order to get the most out of it, I also recommend focusing on the following 3 things. The first and most important is getting familiar with the different chapter tactics and how to extend certain benefits for longer than just one battle round with the help of successor tactics. The second is Specialism Extremis, the unique but pricey stratagem that auto-wounds its target, making it ideal to remove large threats, but its timing needs to be well considered now with the limited starting CP of War Zone Nephilim. Then lastly, an Army of Renown list can be surprisingly mobile thanks to the teleport stratagem, the Beacon and Chalice or Phobos units, and I recommend to always keep these in mind for either early game redeployment or some late game objective scoring. All in all, while complex, our Army of Renown is an incredibly thematic and fun way to play Deathwatch, and I highly recommend it even for beginners who already got their first couple of games in. So that's it for building a Deathwatch Army of Renown list for beginners. Any additional advice from the more veteran viewers, and how do newcomers feel about picking up the Army of Renown? Any recent success stories? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos, as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.